Two of my all-time favorite shows are Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Teen Wolf. And if I love to do anything, it's compare. Obviously, these shows are very, very different from each other, but they do have similar elements, and that's what I like to think about. What would a crossover look like between these two shows? Being that the Teen Wolf movie just came out, Buffy just hit 20 years, I feel like it's the perfect time to open up this discussion with the internet. I don't know if anyone is obsessed with both of these shows in the way that I am, but you know, if I've learned anything from being on the internet, is usually there is at least one other person out there. So first off, just let me do a disclaimer, okay? Guys, this is for shits and giggles. This is all for fun, okay? If anything doesn't, fit you what you think it would be, please do not take offense to it. It's just for funsies, you know what I mean? So first off, I'm gonna say Lydia and Willow. Okay, so the reason, are they both redheads? Yes. Did that really go into my thinking here? A little bit. I think the interesting thing about this is that they are both somebody who didn't come into their powers until a little later in the series. I just think that's fun to kind of give a character who maybe started out as like the brains in a sense to now have this other power that they can be helpful in the group with. Now granted, I do have a better matchup for Lydia, I feel like, but that just like essence of a character I felt like was very similar. Obviously like Lydia and Willow were very different personality wise, but more like structurally as far as that goes is why I'm making that comparison. Okay, next up, who do we have to pair with Cordelia Chase? Okay, listen, I have a couple ones here that you could argue. I think one is stronger than the other. Ultimately, my first thought was Jackson, more so on the thought that they were both rich girlies, the popular girlies, you know what I mean? They were kind of like a bully in a sense, okay? You do see glimpses of the good side of them, but I think they are just so, within themselves and what they're going through that they just kind of act out. And I think a little glimpse into their similarities would be like how Jackson, became the Kanama because he didn't, really have that identity because he was adopted and he didn't know who his real parents were. And for Cordelia, it was just kind of breaking, what she had known for, up until that point of her life when, she wasn't the actual rich girly anymore. And then the popular girls started like shunning her out and she became more of a part of the Scoobies. Now, my stronger argument is Lydia and Cordelia. The reason why I say this, now obviously Cordy, I feel like was a lot meaner than Lydia. I think Lydia, the idea of Lydia was more that like, yes, she was popular. Yes, she like has attitude and stuff like that. But it really was just her playing into the role that she needed to be. And it's kind of like how Allison, her best friend saw past that and saw how incredibly smart? She was incredibly smart. How incredibly smart she was. And, eventually she was able to showcase that. And same with Cordelia. I feel like, Cordelia, one of the greatest character progressions. We're not gonna talk about what happened in Angel. I can't do it, guys. We're just gonna chalk it up to Joss Whedon hates women at the end of the day. It's what it really is. It's what it really is. I feel like you saw both characters start off a certain way and really evolve into who they were and matured into who they were and took their role, in this whole, supernatural, things that were going on much more seriously than they maybe would have in the beginning of the show. An interesting fact, I think it's worthwhile to note, is that Lydia was bitten by Peter, and that's how we suspect she got her banshee powers, because obviously she didn't turn into a werewolf and she didn't die. So she got these banshee powers, and for Cordy, obviously, Doyle kissed her, passed on the powers that be powers to her, so I feel like that's interesting. An interesting parallel is all. All right, so let me do a little PSA before this next comparison, because people would be up in arms, and I'm 100% with you. On this comparison alone, am only talking about their purpose-ish as a character. Maybe not even that, like structurally, like what were they put in to be? And ultimately that is the human that typically always stays human and is a sense of comic relief and kind of sarcastic. And that would be Stiles Stilinski and Xander. Now, the reason why everybody would be up in arms, Stiles Stilinski, beloved character, beloved man in this universe. Xander Harris, you know. The thing about Xander, You know, when I first watched Buffy, it's kind of like the idea of like the honeymoon phase where you don't see the red flags. So the first time I watched Buffy, I was like, oh, I liked Xander. And I thought like he had cute moments, which don't get me wrong, like Xander has some nice moments. But as an overall, we can't sit here and say that Xander Harris is a better man because he's simply not. He's simply not. We could do a whole other video on Xander to explain why. Stiles he was a boy, but he was more respectful than Xander Harris as a person. So at the end of the day, it's really just that. Also, I think it's interesting to note how both Stiles and Xander have dated a similar kind of character. So Malia and Anya, which I will get to that. It is just funny like how they both gravitated towards that kind of character. Can I just say one thing? Stiles Stilinski would have never left Anya at the altar. He wouldn't have. He wouldn't have, simply because he's a better man. He's a better man. He's a better man. Stiles Stilinski is a better man than Xander Harris. I think we all know this. Whilst I'm comparing them in the like grand scheme of things, like are they like truly similar to their core and to people? No. Just in their purpose or their starting purpose of the show. Now let's hop into Malia and Anya. The reason why I say they're so similar is because they both have the backgrounds of they were missing from society, actual real human connection society for so long. So they don't have these preconceived social norms. You know, for Anya, she was a human at one point, but she was a vengeance demon. So she's still, you know, vengeance demon, add that into it. And then, you know, she was that for so long. Now that she's jumped into being a human, a lot of these things she hasn't learned. And that's fun because that actually makes the character like more relatable in a sense, because she's not socially conforming, she's just being herself. And same thing with Malia, I think she was like 7 or 8 before she turned into Coyote and stayed that way until they found her maybe when she was 17 or so, you know, in Teen Wolf. So once again, doesn't have those social norms and does struggle with like day-to-day things that normal people have been socially conformed to, or at least masking to act like they know what to do. Obviously in this world, shows are not going to exist where there would ever be a crossover, but I think it's funny in that like I feel like Malia and Anya would get along really, really well just because they're like kind of two sides of the same coin. Now next up is Argent and Giles. Now the reason I have this comparison is I would say Argent is the only real parent in this that has skin in the game as far as knowing about all the supernatural things. So from a knowledge level, I feel like they kind of meet each other similarly, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, Giles was like basically a dad to Buffy, and Argent was Allison's dad. But I think the thing about them is they kind of looked over the group. Obviously, Argent was a little bit different in that like it wasn't as of deep. I would say Giles has a deeper connection to the Scoobies than maybe Argent did to the group, but Argent was going to be there and help out when he could. But I would say if I had to match them up, that would be like the closest. It is kind of hard because obviously they're different shows and, you know, different roles being played in each show. You know, in Buffy, there was just Joyce and it was Giles, and those are the only like parental figures that we really have in the show, you know, as opposed to Teen Wolf, where we did have a lot of parental figures that were involved in the storyline in one sense or another. Another matchup for Giles I put in was Deaton. The reason I say Deaton is because in the roles of like, they played this kind of parental figure that was missing from their life, right? Both Buffy and Scott have daddy issues. If you think about it. Now, Scott's dad came a little more involved as we got later on in the series. Like, yes and no, but you know what I mean? As opposed to like Buffy's dad, which we never got to meet. So, and once again, they both do have a large knowledge of like the supernatural things, just in a different way. You know, Deaton and Argent are just educated in different ways. So next we have Derek and Angel. Now, once again, I want to make another preface. Is that even the right way to say it? I don't even know. Derek Hale, to me personally, better man than Angel. I'm just saying. Especially if y'all watch the Teen Wolf movie, okay? Now, Derek hasn't really had a spot where he's been evil, as opposed to Angel, who wasn't jealous, without a soul. But they are essentially good guys who are kind of fighting for this odd redemption, but do have a lot of selfish tendencies at the end of the day. And they are kind of always brooding. Granted, I feel like, I don't know, if I had to guess, you know what, I'd say they probably have equal broody to funniness, in my opinion. We did get some smiles out of Derek Hale, I feel like. But so did we with Angel, more so in the Angel series as opposed to Buffy. And I think essentially they were both in their purpose to the group. Obviously Angel, I feel like, was more of a lead, you know, obviously he had his own show, you know, in kind of guiding and helping out. And I think that's similar more so to how Angel played in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you know, before he had left for LA. Derek Hale, always the better man in my opinion. Listen, I got love for Angel, but he's got a lot of flaws too. You know what I mean? I would argue more flaws than Derek Hale, but that could be a bias. So next up we have Peter and Spike. Now listen, I've had to pick who do I prefer. I prefer Spike. But I think the big things about these guys is that they were evil, they were selfish. I would say Peter had less capacity to love than Spike did, because obviously it was the thing, like, these loveless creatures can love, and Spike didn't even have a soul, but he was very loving in a twisted way. They somehow would always cause so much trouble, but when they needed to go to the good side, they would, or more so when it would serve them to be on the good side. You know, if I'm being kidnapped by Peter and Spike, who do I have more of a chance at persuading to let me go? I personally think Spike. Now, I feel like a lot of people may not say Spike in the sense that, like, he is pretty brutal. You know what I mean? He was William the Bloody. But the thing about Peter is, Peter just lacks a certain emotion or care for people. So that is almost, in a way, what makes him more dangerous. Although, maybe Spike is more dangerous in retrospect. I don't know. What do y'all think? But I think Peter is the more dangerous one in this situation. But I think they're very funny. They're also very sarcastic. And I feel like that's how they kind of both operate in very similar ways. All right, next we gotta talk about the parents, the moms of our supernatural faves, okay? Melissa and Joyce. The thing about them is that I think, not that Joyce didn't have skin in the game, you know, randomly. You know, granted, they did attack in their house many of times. Many of times. How does she afford that? God only knows. God only knows. But they're single moms. They would do anything for their kids. Melissa, I think, was out there fighting more in the battlefield. Obviously, she had a little bit more use than Joyce in the sense that, like, she worked at the hospital. So, like, she was able to help keep things hush-hush. Kind of like a Vampire Diaries-esque, where, like, they always said there were gas leaks. I haven't watched Vampire Diaries in ages. Personally, not a Vampire Diaries fan. Enjoyed it at the time it was out, but when you think about it, why were they trying to, like, play off vampire attacks as gas leaks? What was that? But I think ultimately it kind of took them some time to come around to the, you know, accepting the fact that their kids were supernatural, but at the end of the day, they would do anything for their kids. Okay, next up we have the heroines of the series. We have Buffy Summers and Scott McCall. I also think it's important to note, like, I think there are main characters where, you know, obviously the story started rooting around them. There are other heroines in each series, I will say. But just specifically, you know, speaking about, like, what would be considered the main character. Buffy and Scott were both the leaders. Now, do I think personality-wise they are exactly the same? Not at all. They're more so just like a structural matchup. I think they, you know, in a world where there was a crossover, you know, Buffy and Teen Wolf, I think they would make good allies. I don't really see much comparison out of that other than they would do anything for the people they care about. And there's also the idea of being a hero. That means sometimes you are going to second guess yourself on what you're doing, but you ultimately choose to do the thing that you feel right as the hero, even if people around you are making you feel bad for that. Now, also, there's always a debate. Who had it worse? Now, personally, I think whilst Teen Wolf did a great job with making you care, you know, about the characters. You love the characters, you love their chosen family connection, as you did with Buffy. I think the thing about Buffy is it just had more depth, right? So we got to see more intricate storylines where, yes, we saw, you know, the depth of certain characters in Teen Wolf and, you know, dealing with financial problems, you know, like when Scott was like, do I keep this money because my mother can't keep the lights on because she can't afford it? You know, stuff like that, going through emotional things, grieving. But Buffy just had so much more depth to it and explored those things just in fuller detail. So I think when there's a comparison, it's like, oh, who had it worse? I feel like Buffy did. She was the only Slayer in the world. At least Scott had help. I think there's certainly times when he maybe felt alone, but, like, at least, like, he's a werewolf. There are other werewolves. There was only one Slayer, or, you know, at least two at a time or so, you know, before someone was killed off. But she didn't really have that solidarity you know, essentially because she was the only one in her experience in reality. And it just wasn't the same. They had like more of a pack mentality on Teen Wolf. Obviously, a lot of the pack wasn't wolves, but she just didn't have that same camaraderie, you know, with the other Slayer that there was. I think what it comes down to is Buffy was just lonelier. I feel like this next one people may be upset about. Not that people give that much care. But, you know, Allison and Buffy to me are similar, but I think that's just because like they're strong women. And obviously they have different storylines. But I don't know, there was just something about Buffy and Allison, but I think it's just like the idea of like a strong woman being able to take care of things herself. I think at the end of the day, it was kind of like an essence of, you know, a woman who has to be strong and when she's not feeling strong, and then also like making the sacrifice as far as like going into a battle. My heat just kicked on again. And just accepting that, you know, this could be the end. And I think that ultimately does make a hero at the end of the day. So this next one, not really personality wise, more so just like in essence, Liam and Dawn. Now, once again, very different, very different. I would say more so as in Liam, you could argue, was kind of like a little brother to Scott, just because he was like the new guy in the pack. You know, it was the first person that Scott bit to be in his pack. So in that essence it is. Obviously it's much more complicated and layered in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but like I said, just for comparing things to compare things, that is what I would say. Very different people. I can't say that if, you know, Liam and Dawn both went to the same school, would they be friends? I really don't think so. I really don't think so, to be honest. Next up is Mason and Oz. So obviously Mason did not know that he was the Beast, and similar with Oz until he realized he was a werewolf, but I feel like in essence they are more so like a calmer presence in the show. Now I think Oz is more calmer than Mason, because I think Mason, he had some anxiety, but rightfully so, you know, a lot was going on. Many people may I feel like I say this before anyone, I'm like, many people may not like this. I said Kira and Riley. Now here's the thing. I absolutely loved Kira's character. I thought it was phenomenal. I think we should have explored that storyline even more. And Riley, you know what? I don't think Riley is as bad as I thought he was. More so, I think I just didn't like his storyline, to be honest. And yeah, there are other things that are not great about Riley, but overall, he's not as bad as I felt him to be in the beginning of the series. And I never hated Kira's character. Kira was also a favorite of mine. Something about Riley, I just think he like suffered his storyline, to be honest, because it just, I don't know what it was about it. I just didn't like, especially the Adam thing, it just wasn't a fan. But I think the ultimate idea is like the essence of they didn't know the true story about themselves until later. So obviously Kira didn't know she was a kitsune versus Riley. I mean, at least Riley, he kind of already knew he was like working for the initiative. He just didn't know like he was truly a science experiment. I know it's like we're grasping at straws here for this one, but the reason why I say them is because oddly enough, even though I have my critiques of Riley, in the roles that they played of the main characters coming off this big relationship, right? Scott coming off of Allison, Buffy coming off from Angel, they were more so like a peaceful essence to their life, even though they both kind of suffered not being able to date, ultimately because a lot of things were happening in Beacon Hills, a lot of things were happening in Sunnydale, but ultimately they couldn't really lock that down together. But I feel like they were. It was just kind of like a nice, innocent kind of love in that sense. The last one I have today is Kate and Faith. Now, these two women would truly destroy a world together. I really do believe that. The thing about Kate is she is fucking psychotic, and unlike Faith, I think Faith did have a lot of humanity in her where Kate did not. You know, that's why we saw when, you know, she accidentally killed a real person, we saw her retreat, and it was just kind of the essence of Faith. You know, I'm a bad person, so I'm just gonna play into this, but she's just kind of playing into like what she always has had to be. And that was like kind of the fault of her and why she struggles and kept being the bad guy essentially. But Kate and Faith at their craziest, y'all, you know, let's at least give Faith the benefit of the doubt, because let's remember, Kate burned down a whole house of werewolves with humans in it, okay? You know, clearly she has no moral compass whatsoever. And I think ultimately they both just wanted to take advantage of their powers for personal gain. That is it for today. I just love comparing shows that are similar. Obviously Buffy was like very influential, and you see a lot of these elements, and not that like they're exclusive to Buffy, but like obviously Buffy was a huge deal, and you do see bits and bobs that kind of seem similar in that essence. And one thing I loved about Buffy is I watched Teen Wolf first because I watched that when it started airing, versus I watched Buffy in 2017. So Teen Wolf was like my teenage years and Buffy was like my adulthood in that sense. So what I loved, you know, the idea of chosen family, doing what you need to do, and I just love like a supernatural show anyways, like seeing those core essences also be in another show is really incredible. And yeah, like I said, these things are not exclusive to one thing or another, but I feel like you can see how, yes, previous things in pop culture and television really do influence, you know, the new things. And it is funny, especially with new shows that come out. You're like, ooh, that happened in Teen Wolf. Or you start to watch like all these supernatural shows or all these magic shows, and you see how like things are very similar or how things could have been inspired from one another. But if you have any other thoughts, please leave in the comments. If there's one thing I love to do is debate.